Good afternoon and welcome everyone to this virtual seminar hosted by the Democracy Forum on COVID-19 pandemic. What impact will it have on China's foreign policy, on its internal stability, and to what extent should or will China be held accountable? Now, there's been for some time pushback against an expanding Chinese influence, its interference, as some say, and there's an increasing talk of a new Cold War. So when I was first asked to host this seminar some months back now, I called a contact in the US. I said, well, what's really going on with China? And he said, there's this guy in Ohio, he's a salesman, and he wants a promotion. And he's wants to impress his boss, so he's having him home for dinner. He calls his wife and he says, look, the boss is coming for dinner, but the boss doesn't like anything to do with China. He's been listening to the White House. So can you just get rid of everything to do with China and then we can have a nice dinner? So the boss turns up with the salesman and they drive in and they see, firstly, there are no cars. And then the front door's down. All the furniture has gone from the house and there are no curtains. There's no wife either. There's just a note, handwritten, because there are no computers, saying, sorry, dear, can't make it. I've got nothing to wear. That is essentially in a way, what we're talking about when we talk about the new Cold War with China, because it is so interlocked, it's very difficult to know how things are going to unfold. COVID-19 is acting as a catalyst for us to reorder our thoughts. How do we furnish our houses without a Chinese-reliant supply chain? And what sort of country is China? And what does it really want to achieve? And this afternoon, we have a panel of huge expertise: Charlie Parton, Rana Mitter, Veerle Nouwens, and Kerry Brown. I'll give details on each before they speak. Our virtual audience out there can participate by sending in questions, which I'll either put to each panelist at the end of their presentation or during the question and answer session afterwards, before we hear a final analysis from the former Shadow International Trade Secretary, Barry Gardner, MP. But first, we're going to begin with Charles Parton, Senior Associate Fellow from the Royal United Services Institute, and his paper last year on where to draw the line between China's legitimate global influence and its unacceptable interference caused a storm. He's currently writing a paper setting out the UK strategy for China because he argues that at present there isn't one. And today he's telling us about China's internal stability. So Charlie Parton, the floor is yours.
Can you hear anything, Humphrey?
Are you speaking, Charlie? You should be.
No, I've been off. I've been off air. I don't know what happened.
I just introduced you, so the floor is yours.
Shall I start then? Sorry about that.
You can start. Yes, please. Yes, please.
Computer phrase. Okay, well, sorry about that, everybody. Just to say that in these days of Hong Kong, trying to link that with COVID, probably not so easy, except that given that the regulations in Hong Kong on COVID have been extended till 4th of June, any protests against what's happened in Beijing overnight have to be limited to 8 persons. Otherwise, the Hong Kong police are going to be arresting about 1 million people. I want to talk very briefly about the initial party reaction to what happened in the COVID crisis. It's domestic and overseas propaganda, and then look at whether that has affected the stability of the regime. If there's time, a quick 4 points to throw out on the external side. Just a reminder that for the Communist Party, the most important thing is to stay in power. It's rather deleterious to health if it loses power, and that requires stability and a lack of protest. In other words, politics will always come before people, and that has been evident in this crisis as well. What the COVID crisis has revealed again is something about the nature of the governance, a reluctance to make decisions at the lower levels. We saw that within the mayor of Wuhan in his press interview, when he said he couldn't take any action until it had been authorized from Beijing, and made the somewhat extraordinary claim that there were no preparations for a crisis of this nature, despite 2003 and the SARS. What it also shows is that all blame must attach to the local official and never to the center, because the Communist Party is all competent. And that again, amongst local officials, reinforces a reluctance to take decisions. And we also again saw how information can be dangerous and needs to be controlled. Whether that's Dr. Li Wenliang, whether it's Shanghai laboratories being closed, or the arrest of ad hoc reporters and others online. So the result of all that, I think, was a fairly poor start. But then in that case, one can say that politicians worldwide have been reluctant to take actions that might close down economies when the extent of a disease is unknown. And it certainly was, I think, resulted in a lot of diminution of trust in the Communist Party on the part of the people. Quite a lot of, an awful lot of outrage and unhappiness online. So not a great start. I would just say for then coming on to the domestic propaganda campaign, that when you hold a monopoly of power, then, as the Communist Party does, you need to legitimize yourself. And it does that very briefly in 6 ways. 1, by ensuring prosperity. 2, by claiming that China is great again in the center of the world. 3, by claiming that China has regained its territorial integrity, all the territories that it should have owned if it hadn't been for the 100 years of humiliation. 4thly, its governance system is claimed to be far better than any others, including especially the West. Its culture is now respected. And Xi Jinping and the Communist Party is solving the new contradictions of income gaps, the environment, and poverty, etc. So that's how it, and I'll come back to those when I talk about the way the propaganda campaigns have gone out. Again, not a great start when trying to appropriate Dr. Li Wenliang as a Communist Party member, and the call to be thankful to the party went down very well. But as the measures, the very strict measures for controlling the virus started to bear fruit, I think that they did do well, much better to gain some of the lost ground, and showed that Xi Jinping was now firmly in control, that hospitals could be built in 10 days, although I have to say that that's a day longer than it took the National Health Service to build twice the number of beds, but never mind. And once they were, and undoubtedly the party has been successful in controlling COVID within China. And whatever the statistics and how reliable they are, I don't think one should be carping about that fact, even if they're double or whatever. So the propaganda campaign has now switched very much to getting the economy back on its feet. And that goes back to that first legitimacy I talked about. The Communist Party can guarantee a rising prosperity to its people. And a negative side of all this, of course, has been the control of information and much tighter censorship. But on a whole, you would say with the domestic propaganda campaign, clawed some ground back, but still perhaps on the negative side of the balance. And then we come to the external propaganda campaign. And of course, the first thing to remember is that the main audience of the external propaganda campaign is, of course, the Chinese people, the domestic audience. What it's trying to do in that campaign is to show that really, actually, it's trying to cover the mess up at the start by showing that China is saving the world and that it's outperforming the US, the UK, the European Union at dealing with the crisis. And that has been playing really quite strongly on those legitimacies which I talked about. Here is China, great again at the center of the world, sorting out the problem, unlike the USA. There's been a lot of activity around Taiwan, a little bit more stable saber rattling, but just to emphasize that the party's on the way to getting back territorial integrity. There's been an awful lot about how much better the form of governance has performed than we have in the West. Some talk about the superiority of Chinese culture, going its helpfulness and its peacefulness, and of course, Xi Jinping, as soon as he did get out of Beijing, has been putting that emphasis on that last legitimacy of poverty alleviation, evening up those gaps in income, etc., and the environment. First visit to Zhejiang, and he made point of going to talk in an environmental situation. So I would say that by the end of that, I think the party is up, and any sort of talk, as there was at the beginning of the crisis, of this being China's Chernobyl, it was always out of kilter anyway, but certainly is now. So, has it worked, and how stable is the Communist Party rule? Well, I think the first thing to say is that, against what many people seem to believe, the Communist Party is very fragile. It feels itself very fragile, and has done for a long time. If you go back to December and the very important Central Economic Work Committee meeting, what came out of that was the 6 stabilities. I won't go into great depth, but the first one, of course, was unemployment or employment. Just a little while ago, we then had the 6 ensures. They do love these slogans, which is why my 6 legitimacies, which are mine and not the Communist Party's, incidentally, they don't talk about them, but I clearly got the number right. And recently, very recently, they set up another of these leading small groups, coordination group, called the Peaceful China Construction Group. But if you look at the constituency of it, it consists of all the tough ministries, the intelligence services, the legal ministries, the proctorate, the prosecutors, the courts, etc. It's very much about ensuring that the leadership and cadres are in line. So however much unhappiness there was online and however many intellectuals spoke out, I don't think that we should exaggerate the ineffectiveness of this propaganda campaign, and particularly because we in the West messed up, and because and of course the propaganda campaign excises all mention of other successful democracies like Taiwan, Singapore, in Hong Kong to some extent, and South Korea in the way that they dealt with it. But the message, I think, has been reasonably effective back in China. That said, it's very early days because the effects of this crisis are not apparent on the economy yet. And the economy and employment in particular are absolutely crucial. Domestic demand is pretty flaccid, and I think external demand is even more flaccid. And when prosperity is, as it were, the number one legitimacy, the real question is the Communist Party going to be able to keep up the economy and employment when there's a very thin and hardly extensive safety net? And therein lies considerable room for danger and instability in the future. If there was instability, where would it come from? Well, I don't think it's going to come from the leadership levels until things get really, really bad in terms of the economy. If the broad party learned one thing from the fall of the USSR, it was that instability and splits in the leadership were what really sunk the ship. So Xi Jinping has hammered that point home, and whether you oppose Xi Jinping or not, you know that you all hang together. And if things went really bad, it might even be hang together. So I don't see that the leadership is going to split. And in any case, Xi Jinping over the last 5 or 6 years has put in place his men. And if you look at the centers of power in China, and I always number them as 7, he controls 6 of them absolutely, and the 7th, and I can go into detail if you wish, really, he's getting there. So where else? The middle classes? I don't think so. Things have to get really, really bad for the middle classes to rise up. They're still at the moment doing reasonably well. It remains to be seen how they do in the future, but it may not be that religion is the opium of those masses, but education abroad and tourism, things like that are. And so I think I would not necessarily see the middle classes rising up. The groups that really need to be feared are the ones that appear in every single Chinese document, party document. And I haven't had a chance to read Li Keqiang's work report, but I'm sure it will mention them. And those are students, and 8 million of them graduate every year. The rural migrants, there are 290 million of them. Then they don't have a safety net, many of them. And 57 million army veterans, a trained and very fearful group. So if the economy starts and unemployment really starts to impinge upon those people in a serious way, I think there could be trouble. I'm getting near the end of my time. I will just throw out a couple of thoughts. The first is that I don't believe that China will be the superpower of the 21st century, or indeed a superpower. And I've written a paper on that, and you're welcome to read it, but I'm happy to defend that proposition also. But in terms of the external thoughts that I wanted to put out, the first is that however bad the propaganda offensive has been, we've got to work with China in the future, particularly over sorting out pandemics, but further down the line, things like antimicrobial resistance, which will make COVID look like a tea party. So whatever the outcry, and whether it's Wuhan labs or whatever, is not as important as working with China. And divergence is coming in many ways. It may not be decoupling, and we've got to minimize that. So the second point I would make is, don't prejudge the WHO inquiry. It's the best we'll get. And if there aren't decent answers from it, that is the time to pressure China and the Communist Party in particular, and the WHO. Third point I'd like to make is that I really do think we liberal democracies need a central propaganda department. Actually, mistakes that we've made, we allow the Communist Party to run away with this. I mean, Xi Jinping at the WHO pledged $2 billion US. Well, that's a quarter, no, less than a quarter of what the 5th of May European Union fundraising was, which was about 8 billion euros. Or again, as I said before, we built the Nightingale far quicker and far bigger than they build theirs. Let's hear it for what we managed to do. And thirdly, and lastly, sorry, if the COVID crisis shows one thing, it shows us that we need a new strategy on China. It shows us that we really should not be putting our trust in the Communist Party if you see the way that it has acted in these circumstances. That work needs to be done urgently. It has to take into account the fact of divergence that is coming, but it also has to minimize it, because it is a global and connected world, and we do have to get on with China. I think that's 15 minutes, Humphrey, so I'll call an end.
Thank you, Charlie, very much. And there's a stream of questions coming in, which is fascinating. But before you go, I'd just like to get one view from you, given that you were closely involved in the negotiation of the joint declaration. Do these current measures that the Chinese are planning to put into Hong Kong, do they violate that joint declaration? Is it driving a coach and horses through the one country, two systems? Very briefly, but love to know your view.
Yes, it is. I think it's driving a coach and horse through one country, two systems. And if it's not actually breaking the joint declaration, it's severely bending and twisting it. There's some very worrying things in it. I would highlight, apart from the obvious one of going against Basic Law 23 and actually, in a sense, not allowing Hong Kong to pass its own legislation, which is what is laid down. I would highlight the establishment of mainland security organizations in Hong Kong as very worrying. I would highlight the reference that Carrie Lam has to send reports on national security education. If you remember, patriotic education caused a lot of riots in Hong Kong. That's deeply unsettling, the control of education. And finally, we don't yet know what the effects of these crimes of subversion, destructive activities, treason, etc., are going to be on the judiciary. But rule of law is vital, and those definitions of those are very wide within China. Under a common law system, which is very different from the Chinese system, it strikes me that the chances are that the judiciary will be bent into shape, and that is not good for Hong Kong's future. So I think it's extremely worrying, and I think the UK should be making a large amount of fuss about an international treaty at the UN which is being violated.
Charlie, thank you for that. Just to recap there, Charlie Parton was one of the negotiators back in the early 90s when the joint declaration was being drawn up. So was clause by clause involved in putting that treaty into the United Nations. Now, we've got a stream of questions coming in, which is fascinating. I'll run through them because I think we're touching on a lot of this with our panelists coming up. Can there be a war between the USA and China? I think Kerry Brown's log to do that one. How will COVID-19 impact the Belt and Road Initiative in Southeast Asia? I think Veerle Nouwens is going to be handling that. And then is COVID-19, far from being China's Chernobyl, actually the West's economic Chernobyl and to China's advantage? Now, our next panelist is going to be Rana Mitter, Professor of History and Politics of Modern China at the University of Oxford. Rana is going to be focusing on nationalism and ideology in China, and if what he says piques your interest, Rana is presenting a documentary on China's global power on Radio 4 on Monday at 8 p.m. British time, that's British Standard Time, and he's got a new and timely book out, China's Good War, How World War II is Shaping a New Nationalism, and that's out in September. Rana Mitter, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much indeed, Humphrey. Thank you for hosting so ably. Thanks to Lord Bruce for bringing this together. And thanks to Charlie for starting us off in such excellent form. If I could start by just picking up on Charlie's last thought in a sort of relay, as it were, and putting another thought out there for our audience as well. It seems to me that as we rethink what our relationship, meaning, the wider, more liberal world is with China, I think it's absolutely right to say that we can't simply do everything China wants, but we can't ignore it either. And I think the missing brick in the wall of our own response at the moment, again, speaking here for a moment in terms of looking at the view from London rather than necessarily the entire world, is of course Europe. We have just left the European Union, as you may not be surprised to hear. Right now, the political atmosphere, at least in governing circles, seems to be to try and separate ourselves as much from the existing European Union as possible. This, of course, is going to be very, very difficult in terms of maintaining a firm, friendly and frank relationship with China and making sure we understand that the large number of liberal democracies on our doorstep, France, Germany and the others, who also have an interest in making sure that we have a good but robust and clear relationship with China, is going to be the most important element of the next set of alliances. So I think it's time to stop playing games about Europe and getting serious on that question, particularly if we're thinking about China. You may not agree. If so, please do send in the questions. Happy to debate it. Okay, what I'm going to do in the next 10 minutes or so is to give you some thoughts that, in a sense, draw back slightly from what Charlie had to say, which was very much, out of the headlines, here and now, up to the minute sort of account of how we should look at the COVID crisis. What I'm going to do instead is to give you 3 or 4 quick points about what I think the worldview of China is as it approaches not only the COVID crisis specifically, but the wider sense of its own survival. And I think beyond that, the desire very substantially to grow China's influence in the wider world. And I'm going to touch on 4 points. Everyone always gives you 3 points. So Democracy Forum, we go for the bonus, we give you 4. That's going to be Marxism-Leninism, traditional Chinese culture, the role of China as an actor in what we now call the global south, in other words, the non-Western world, you might say, and the role of history. And I'll give you just a minute or two on each of those to explain why I think they make a very potent mixture in terms of the way that China thinks about itself and thinks about its role in the world. The one thing I think that all these elements have in common is that they have very little in them that is liberal. And I'm not using the word liberal here in some sort of judgmental sense of either if you are a liberal, that's a good thing, or if you're not a liberal, then, you know, it's a sign of kind of weak-kneedness. I'm pointing out that in terms of many of the things which I think most people on this call value, in terms of the idea of individuated rights, the idea of managed pluralism, the idea of dissent as being good in its own right, these are not things that flow from the Chinese Communist Party's worldview. Now, you might disagree with that very strongly in terms of a worldview, and I have to say it's not my personal worldview, and I've talked to many Chinese communist officials and made this clear. But I think that is a different thing from arguing that it's inauthentic or in some way does not represent what they really think. The idea that we just sort of talk to them enough, they're going to realize that being a proper liberal democrat like us is the liberal democrat with the small L and small d, I hasten to add, is the way to go. So the argument, I think, needs to bring that in and in no way stand down from our own principles of liberalism and democracy, which are absolutely right and should be maintained, but understand where the other side on this is coming from too. So let me be specific. First of all, I think it often gets underestimated, partly because in its international propaganda, as Charlie said, we don't tend to hear so much about it. China is still a country whose leaders take Marxism-Leninism very, very seriously. And this is one of the things that I think is very evident if you read the Chinese language articles coming out of China in theoretical journals like Qiu Shi, which actually means seeking truth, or seeking facts, I should say, but is very, very important. It's a theoretical journal for the party. And the Marxist-Leninist viewpoint has an awful lot of things in it that are not liberal at all. There's a very sort of black and white view of things that, you know, one should either be part of the ruling political structures or those that are seeking to undermine them. The idea of a kind of agreed dissent within it, the Menshevik position, you might say, is simply not there. And all of the cadres in China at the moment are being encouraged to read widely in the Marxist-Leninist classics. This is one element which is, I think, something that Xi Jinping himself will be very proud to say, if asked, that he is a Marxist. And I think, or Marxist-Leninist, that's a very specific thing. It's not purely the same thing as being a Marxist. And understanding that as a starting point, I think is very important. That then combines with something very important, which perhaps gets more attention in recent days, but often in a rather sort of simplistic way. And that's the idea that traditional culture, traditional Chinese thought from the pre-modern period, the thought of Confucius, the thought of Mencius, the thought of Sun Tzu, the art of war, sort of Zhuangzi, Xunzi, other Chinese thinkers, is once again being brought together as a means of understanding the wider world within which China finds itself. Now, let's be specific about this. This is not in any way saying that China's Communist Party either is a Confucian organization. In many ways, it was founded as a reaction against the Confucian past of 100 years ago. Nor is it to say that everything, or even most things that the Chinese Communist Party does, can be interpreted through a Confucian lens. And there are many principles, actually, which we would agree with, I think, in the West, and which China's party wouldn't push back against, like gender equality, which are very un-Confucian in the classic sense, but actually, I think, you know, at least in political terms, are not something that the Chinese Communist Party would in any sense look to push against. But wider ideas of hierarchy, wider ideas that the way that you carry out particular sorts of ritual behavior, if you want to put it that way, Li, in the classic form, and the belief in certain ideas like Ren, often translated as benevolence, these sorts of ideas are very important ideas, I think, in shaping the Confucian elements, traditional elements in contemporary Chinese thinking. And again, there are many things, but for the most part in the CCP's, the Chinese Communist Party's interpretation, they're not liberal in their assumptions. That doesn't mean that you can't be Confucian and liberal. And there are plenty of Confucian liberals in Taiwan, in South Korea, in other countries that are impeccably democratic, but also have a Confucian background. But for historical reasons, that is not the path that China has taken. So understanding how Confucianism fits in without going for some kind of, self-help dime store type of understanding of Confucianism, the kind of books you buy at airports, is, I think, an important second element in understanding where this is coming from. The idea of zheng and xie, orthodox and unorthodox, very, very strong still, and not much in between. The third point, and I think, again, this flags up something that I think that Veerle and others are going to say later about the Belt and Road Initiative. China sees itself, and has done for decades, as a sort of harbinger, as a kind of flag carrier for what we now call the global south. Used to be the third world, developing world, different terms have been used for it. But the idea of the non-Western, non-Northern European, non-North American world. And in that sense, although I think COVID has done a great deal to damage China's reputation in that part of the world, there are still large parts of Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, where China has made a pretty good impression in many ways in terms of bringing investment and its wider plans to it. Now, that's not to say there are not lots of things, not least the famous debt diplomacy, which has got various countries like Sri Lanka into trouble, that mar China's record. But I think we'd be foolish to argue that the whole of China's international engagement on an economic front is simply a front, simply a sham, simply hollow, because actually large numbers of people in the non-Western world still don't regard it that way. And the fourth element I want to bring up is the idea of history as a really important mechanism in shaping the way that China thinks about itself and its role in the world. And I'd say that one word, if you're going to pick one out, that really makes a difference is war. China sees itself, for very good reasons, as a country that has been invaded multiple times since the mid-19th century, coming up to the mid-20th, of course, the war against Japan during World War II, being one of the most potent areas of that. And if you live in Britain, and I think many of the people on this call do live in Britain, then you will know that we are obsessed as a country, absolutely obsessed with the Second World War. Brexit is actually the Second World War. COVID, actually the Second World War. We even have, thank God, still with us, Veerle Nouwens and indeed, of course, Her Majesty as well, people who lived through the war and are brought in for their World War II connections. What a lot of people do not realize, and actually the subject of that book I've written, which Humphrey kindly mentioned at the beginning, is that the Chinese have also become, in recent years, the last few decades, obsessed with World War II as well. They point out actually things we all ought to know. You know, more than 10 million dead in China between 1937, they started early, and 1945, holding down 500,000 Japanese troops or more until the British and the Americans turned up after Pearl Harbor. But the Chinese had been fighting for 4.5 years before that. Of course, much of the fighting was done by Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists rather than the communists, but they were both involved. And it makes a pretty good discourse now in terms of giving a metaphor for internal Chinese consumption as to what's going on. If you want to see that, just look up any of the hundreds and hundreds of articles on the Chinese web that you can find talking about the 中国人民战争, the Chinese people's war against the virus. And that phrasing is identical to the phrasing used by Chairman Mao in his talk about the people's war against the Japanese in the 1930s and 40s, and a phrase that's been used over and over again. So if you know where to find them, and it's not that hard, there are plenty of historical references and metaphors. On the one hand, they're clearly being used for political purposes. You know, COVID is not the Second World War. China is not being invaded. Let's be very clear about that. But also, like Britain's obsession with World War II, there is a sort of emotional depth to it that is not inauthentic. And just as we shouldn't laugh at people using World War II metaphors because they speak to something rather deep in the national psyche in Britain, the same is also true of China and its history of being victimized and invaded. We have to understand it, we have to acknowledge it, but we also have to point out that it's not an excuse in and of itself for the actions against entry into the liberal world that we've talked about. So I'm getting up to time there, and I'm going to finish, if I may, by just bringing COVID into all of that, because I think that wider worldview that I've mentioned, Marxism-Leninism, traditional culture, this global South leadership role, and the role of history, and there are many other elements too, but those are four important ones, have all been accelerated in a sense by what's happened in the last few weeks on COVID. Charlie had it absolutely right. There was some thinking at the beginning of the crisis that it might, you know, create a crumbling of China's system. In fact, it's done very much the opposite. But what it's done, I think, is an irony. And I'm going to leave with this thought because I want to throw it to the other panelists and then having the discussion. I think, as it looks at the moment, that mixture has strengthened China's party system at home. I think actively strengthened it. When I talk to Chinese friends, and I do quite often, they're pretty pleased with the way in which their government has managed the COVID pandemic. But I think it has significantly weakened China's reputation in the wider world, even in the global south, places like Nigeria, for instance, which previously had been quite favorable towards China. Now they see it as the source of the pandemic, and they don't see China's somewhat triumphalist language about it, that people's war, as being a good explanation for why they suddenly find themselves in such difficulty. As Humphrey kindly mentioned, I'll be talking more about this and other issues on Radio 4 in the UK on Monday, and also repeated on Wednesday and on BBC Sounds, just for the full plug for anyone who can't listen at those times. But obviously, I'll be around and happy to talk with other panelists and anyone questioning when this session is over. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being part of this, and I hope we'll continue that discussion very shortly.
Thank you, Rana. Your insight there is fairly controversial. Stuff is coming in. I just want to wrap it up and throw one particular question to you. I mean, one of the interesting ones, which isn't to you, is that if we're holding China accountable for COVID-19, who held the United States accountable for the global financial crisis that originated there and was covered in smoke and mirrors and everything like that? But just to amalgamate some of the thoughts that are coming in, you used the phrase good and robust relationship with the Chinese government. Somebody says, or amalgamation says, given that they've got 2 million people in camps in Xinjiang and carry out various other tyrannical things, what should be good about that relationship?
Oh, I think that the answer to good does not mean that we should be sitting there saying that everything is fantastic, and very much the opposite. And I think last night's news about the imposition, potentially the imposition, but I think almost certainly of the new national security law in Hong Kong, sorry, I slipped the tongue there, in Hong Kong is a sign of something that we should be very vocal about. In fact, some people have seen I was on BBC News last night saying that, and I'll be on France 24 tonight saying something quite similar. So no doubt about that. But I throw back the question to the questioner. What are you saying that the alternative should be? Are you saying that every single Chinese student in the UK, of whom there are tens of thousands, should be rounded up and deported? Are you saying that all of the Huawei equipment that already exists in the BT system in this country should be ripped out tomorrow and thrown out? Are you saying that we should cut off a trade relationship with a country with in the immediate aftermath of a decision to leave our own closest trading partners? These are genuine questions. My point is that if we are robust with China beyond, to a certain point, that's great, but they have consequences. I'd like you to think about what those consequences are and tell me what we should do.
Well, that opens up a whole new debate, but we're now going to Veerle Nouwens, a research fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. Her specialism is on geopolitical relations in the Asia-Pacific region, and she is currently writing a paper on what the UK's relationship with what's now called the Indo-Pacific should be. She's going to outline for us China's relationship with its neighbors, including the latest ups and downs of the Belt and Road Initiative. I guess the question there is, if Beijing can't get it right in Asia, what chance does it have of getting it right in the wider world? Veerle Nouwens, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you so much. I mean, and thanks to the other two panelists for really kicking us off in a fantastic way. Those were some really incredible points, and I really enjoyed particularly Rana's discussion around ideology and thinking within China, because that directly impacts China's foreign policy. And I think that's something that we really have to remember when we look at how China behaves externally. So what I'm going to try and talk about today in my 15 minutes is that really China has managed to bring the situation of COVID under control domestically, but it has really suffered some pretty severe economic and diplomatic fallout. And this is going to shape how it continues to evolve its foreign policy moving forward. So I am going to touch about Asia, but I'm also going to talk about some other regions, simply because Belt and Road, as we all know, is a global endeavor. Now, firstly, in the two sessions today, as it kicked off, Premier Li Keqiang said that China is committed to building a global community of common destiny, and that this is really characterized through peaceful development and through advancing cooperation and friendship with other countries. And China has certainly, as we all know, embarked on a drive of providing COVID aid. We've seen this through mass diplomacy. We've seen this through providing PPE, but also sending medical personnel, including to Southeast Asian countries and its immediate neighborhood. And China's really done this to kind of regain control over the international narrative around it. It tries to also fix its image as a responsible international actor, because it does want to be cast in a positive light. And this is a pretty bad stain on its international reputation at the moment. So this has led, I think, to a really proactive move by Beijing to control that narrative and to provide itself as a successful model for how other countries can use technology, for example, to control the COVID pandemics within their own countries. It's highlighted bilateral assistance initiatives, which quite frankly were easy to highlight if we're very honest, because the EU response, for example, towards Italy's call for assistance was not met very quickly. And so whilst I agree with Charlie that we need to ourselves recapture the narrative as thinking, putting a Western country hat on, we need to be proactive as well to be able to fill those gaps where China very easily can step in and say, look what we're doing, we're helping so much. So it goes both ways. I think by doing this, China has clearly sought to also obviously deflect a lot of attention to what seems to have been a delayed initial response to the outbreak internally. But despite these promises and gestures of goodwill, China has also wielded a stick, and it hasn't been necessarily very friendly to all countries. And this has taken the form of a very aggressive approach in terms of wolf warrior diplomacy, which is of course a style of public relations, foreign policy, and strategic communications that is very assertive, which seeks to make no apologies, and which is quite aggressive in defending China's image. Chinese officials in this form of diplomacy have recently en masse, turned to Twitter and other communication platforms to discuss, firstly, how positive China has handled this whole situation, but also, they have engaged in spreading conspiracy statements and conspiracy theories, be it whether COVID potentially may have started in Italy, or whether the United States military brought COVID to China, and that this was actually the origin of the COVID pandemic. They've also made some pretty extraordinary statements. We've seen some extraordinary statements coming out of the embassy of China to France, where, I'm paraphrasing here, but effectively it was said that, the French government didn't care for its elderly and was simply letting the elderly die in their care homes. We've seen also studies from different think tanks show that there's been an uptick in Chinese disinformation campaigns on online platforms. And despite the uproar around, or the conversation around the EU disinformation reports coming from the External Action Service, we do at the same time see that the EU itself has recognized that there has been, from Chinese sources, a disinformation campaign around COVID online. Now, wolf warrior diplomacy has also included threats of economic retaliation. So it's not just about spreading disinformation or a different narrative. It's also about wielding potentially a stick in response to countries who are not falling in line. And we've seen this particularly in the case of Australia. Of course, Australia's initiative to call for an international investigation into the COVID origin has been met with, firstly, threats that Chinese citizens would maybe not be interested in buying Australian goods anymore. But we've since seen this been followed up by the fact that Australian beef imports, for example, have been met with difficulties around standards and all kinds of other administrative issues. And whilst China denies that this is in retaliation for Australia's position on the investigation, it's also quite conveniently timed. And this is not necessarily a new tactic that we've seen. But I think what's interesting in this is that in Chinese foreign policy at the moment, it's not a blanket strategy that's being applied to all. So not all of these countries are being dealt with in the same way. So it's interesting, for example, that New Zealand, which has joined the call for an international investigation into COVID, was told basically that they weren't going to be met with the same response as Australia has. And we see also, of course, as I mentioned, that in Europe, while some countries have been at the receiving end of some quite assertive wolf warrior diplomacy stratcom, not all countries have had the same experience, as several studies have showed. So we see a more considered approach to Chinese foreign policy, depending on the bilateral relationship that they're dealing with, and probably what the bilateral relationship was like prior to COVID. Secondly, whilst we have that aspect of Chinese foreign policy, there's a question around, of course, if we're talking about carrots and sticks, how does the PLA feature into this? There's a lot of discussion, of course, and I think Charlie already mentioned it, around PLA activity, particularly in the East China Sea, the South China Sea, around Taiwan. And the question here is, I guess, what does this mean? So what have they been doing? They've continued during COVID to have bilateral exercises, for example, with the Cambodian military. They've conducted anti-submarine warfare drills in the South China Sea. They've done sorties across with the PLA Air Force across into Taiwanese territory, just crossing the median line on at least one occasion by the PLA Air Force. There's been, of course, the Chinese Coast Guard entering the waters around the Senkaku Islands and the East China Sea. And we've seen border skirmishes most recently with India. Now, what does that all mean? Is this just business as usual? Is this opportunism? Is it just pushing the boundaries a little bit to see what they can get away with, or to see what the reaction of countries who are dealing with their own COVID situation, what that might be? Or is this a precursor to a more concerted military action by China in its region, so that are they trying to, for example, gain the strategic upper hand while everyone else is distracted? I think there are different views on this, but I personally think that it's more a matter of opportunism, and it's a matter of testing the waters a little bit to see what they can get away with. But it's also very much, again, harking back to that, domestic audience. It's very much about showing to the domestic audience that China has not been weakened. It's also messaging both to the domestic audience and to a foreign audience that nobody should really take advantage of China while they themselves are dealing with COVID still. And as we know, China COVID cases have not totally disappeared, and they're very worried about more waves erupting in the future. But so whilst, we've already discussed a little bit amongst the panelists whether China is in a position of strength or not, I think we can't forget that, as I mentioned in my introduction, China has been hit by COVID. And economically, this does impact its foreign policy. So one way that it will particularly impact its foreign policy is through the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, the Belt and Road Initiative was already from its outset deeply intertwined with domestic objectives, for example, in exporting overcapacity, in finding new markets. It's really about exporting Chinese companies as well and globalizing them. So this has a very domestic element, but it also has a very important economic element to it. And when we think about the importance of the Belt and Road, we can't forget that this is a flagship foreign policy initiative for Xi Jinping, for China and the CCP more generally. And we can debate about, when it started and what its origins were and how long it's been going on. But since 2013, hundreds of billions of dollars have been invested into this initiative globally in infrastructure projects and more. And so when we think about what the impact could be, we have to remember that quite a lot of these countries, be it in Asia, be it in Africa or elsewhere, or even Latin America, that these are low income and some of them high risk countries. So in that sense, I think that, whilst I agree with Rana 100% that a lot of these countries are very willing to take Chinese loans, and we can't dismiss that. These infrastructure projects often meet real development needs in these countries. Sometimes they don't, but often they do. These countries are not necessarily looking to get rid of Belt and Road, to reject it entirely, but they are going to have difficulties in making those payments on the loans. And we can discuss whether we think, Belt and Road and loans are specifically designed to create debt trap diplomacy. I don't think they are necessarily, but totally open for discussion on that. So given the fact that a lot of these projects are in, developing countries, we're already seeing that as COVID spreads around different regions and different countries, this is having an impact on Belt and Road projects. For example, the flagship project of the Belt and Road, which is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, has already flagged some serious concerns over how COVID is impacting the progress of it. So Pakistan's Economic Coordination Committee, for example, has warned that Chinese companies working on CPEC in Pakistan will suffer project delays, that costs are going to rise, that supply chains will be disrupted, but the labor market will also be disrupted in these countries. The specific impact on, say, Gwadar Port is interesting because whilst it's been said that Gwadar Port has not at all been affected by COVID, at the same time, there's been an admission that the impact of COVID on global shipping is having a direct impact on Gwadar Port's operations. So in that sense, again, even if it's not a direct impact, there are second-order economic follow-ons that do impact Belt and Road projects. Now, Pakistan has already requested debt relief in the form of debt repayment extensions, but it's not the only one doing this. There are more countries asking China to write off their debt entirely. And the question is, can China really afford to do so? And what does that mean for its foreign policy vis-a-vis the Belt and Road moving forward? Now, I think that Belt and Road debt write-offs are highly unlikely. We've seen voices coming out of China from the banking community and others, and also from the think tank community, saying that it is simply impossible for China to write off this debt. China can't afford this. And it will need to strike a very careful balance moving forward. So on the one hand, it'll want to do the absolute bare minimum that it can vis-a-vis debt repayment extensions, for example, or maybe writing off interest on that debt, but it can't excuse it altogether. On the other hand, China really depends on Belt and Road as well, as we've said, for its international image and for those global South-South relations. So it is a key marker in its foreign policy. So how does it balance those two things? And that's something that I think they're thinking about quite heavily. But whilst we anticipate more news coming out of China around this, I think they're going to take a very bilateral approach to dealing with Belt and Road project financial issues and economic impacts. I think also that while some projects are going to face delays, I think maybe we'll be looking at China prioritizing different regions. So Southeast Asia, for example, is a key region for China, not only because it does really, even given its strength and given its military assertiveness in the South China Sea, for example, it does need countries in the region to be on board to a certain extent with Chinese engagement and presence there. So in addition to that, I think the supply chain issue, while we're talking about Chinese supply chains being disrupted, as particularly Western countries seek to decouple to varying extents or saying that they're looking into this, I think we also can't forget that Chinese companies have been moving into Southeast Asia and trying to, boost their own businesses using cheaper labor markets there. So again, China is already very tied into the region. It does need the region's cooperation, and so this is a win-win situation. Although I don't like to use this term, but I think in terms of focusing on Southeast Asia in particular, this works for China. I think we'll also see a move into a difference in how Belt and Road projects are being prioritized. Internally in China, to shore up the economy, the government has said that they would like to focus on new technology and new infrastructure, and that includes things like AI, Internet of Things, 5G. I think we'll see the same in Belt and Road projects to really focus a bit more on some of these high-tech digital Silk Road initiatives, maybe looking at digital health solutions for developing countries. Ultimately, however, I think Southeast Asian countries, as I mentioned, are wary of China. They want Chinese investment. They do need to have a cordial relationship with their neighbor, but it is with one eye open, one eye closed to see how that relationship evolves bilaterally. Now, just to wrap things up, I think how Chinese foreign policy will move, forward from this point on, I think depends on a few things. Firstly, Chinese domestic economic recovery and the progress of this, I think, will play a real role in how Chinese foreign policy develops. And we can't forget, again, the prioritization of China's domestic audience in its foreign policy. Second of all, I think that the foreign policy advisors to Chinese leadership and their perception of how current Chinese strategic communications and foreign policy is being received, if they start to understand or start to at least flag that this is a problem and that it's not working in Chinese favor, potentially we'll see a bit of a shift there. And finally, in terms of Chinese foreign policy, particularly, for example, in Southeast Asia, how that evolves will also depend on how other countries step in and work with Southeast Asian countries. So I think this, we're talking here about not just the United States, but also Japan and the European Union and the infrastructure initiatives that they have already proposed to this region. So I'll leave it at that, and I look forward to the questions.
Veerle, thank you so much for that. A great insight. I have a question for you to follow up, and then I'll go through some of the others that are coming in. You went through, the India, China, Japan, China, Taiwan, China, South China Sea, China, all these sort of irritating flashpoints. And in the past couple of weeks, I think it is, we've seen each of those flare up, initiated from Beijing. Can you lay out for us, where are China's allies in Asia? Does it have any alliance that matches the US, Japan, US, Korea, even the US, Thailand, or British Singapore one?
Thank you. Look, that's a really interesting question. China doesn't do formal alliances officially, but it does, of course, have partners in Asia that it is closer to than others. So Cambodia is one. I think Pakistan obviously is another. There's discussions around Myanmar and what the Myanmar relationship is with China, which is very much one that isn't entirely positive. I think Myanmar is quite wary of Chinese engagement, but it also has very few other options. So when we talk about who are China's allies, I think that's an almost slightly misleading question. I do think we need to talk about what is the strategic environment in Asia, and specifically Southeast Asia, that China is looking at and that it's operating in. And that's one that is very much focused on keeping a careful balance between engaging with China, but also understanding and being wary of the risks. But at the end of the day, even if these countries are extremely hesitant about China and anxious about its potential ultimate ambitions in this region, I think that these countries obviously cannot move their location. They are permanently going to be neighbors with China, and they need to find a way to deal with it.
Bill, thank you very much for that. Just to give a taste before we move on of the sort of questions that are coming in, given that China is predominantly an economic power, where exactly in the world is it a threat or a military threat? Why can't we treat the violations to the rule of law by China like any other country or institution, like we did with Volkswagen and an airline that doesn't do things right? And the BRA, the Belt and Road Initiative, does that have a good component that could be useful to the developing world? And then there's one other one that I think Kerry Brown might answer sometime in his presentations. How long will Xi Jinping survive? Kerry Brown is our last but certainly not least professor of the Lao China Institute at King's College and a hugely prolific author. And I think he must have sort of run out of titles because he does so many books, because his next book out in July is called simply China, A Concise History. And the way things are unfolding, it'll need to be in everyone's back pocket, I should imagine. Kerry is going to outline for us the US-China relationship, which is a kind of war or peace issue. We already had one of those questions. And whether instead of the current single rules-based world order that we have at the moment, there's going to have to be a dual track one to accommodate these two different ideologies and value systems. So Kerry Brown, the floor is yours.
Humphrey, can you hear me okay? Does it come across okay?
It does to me, yes.
Excellent. Okay, that's good. Look, thank you very much for inviting me, and it's good to hear my old colleagues and friends. So I got the sort of rather unenviable task of talking really about the kind of geopolitics. I suppose I'll sort of start by saying a little bit about mindsets. I think in the sort of last 40 years, a lot of the sort of approach to China by Europe and America and others, but if you say Europe and America, has been a sort of division between saving and damning China. On the one hand, we want to save China by helping it with its political and legal and other reforms through economic engagement. And I think sometimes many people over the years have also been claiming that China is close to collapse, that it's unsustainable, and if it doesn't change, it's going to fall apart. And I suppose we never ever thought that we'd be in a position where China could actually turn the tables and save or damn us. Now that may sound provocative, but I think COVID-19 and the impact it's had in China, which has been serious, were it to have only been a Chinese issue, which it kind of looked a little bit like in January, a bit like a sort of replay of SARS from nearly 20 years ago, kind of predominantly Asian Chinese issue. If that were the case, I think there'd be all sorts of criticisms about how the Chinese government's sort of system had been ineffective, and this sort of proved that there was a big problem with the way that China is ruled, with its highly centralized governance system, as Charlie and others have pointed out, under Xi Jinping. But as the problem has kind of gone from firstly China to Europe and the Middle East, and then Europe, then America, and now Latin America, it has proved that everywhere has had a massive challenge in dealing with this problem. And that is because the problem is very difficult and terrible. So I'm not criticizing anyone, any government for not being able to deal with it well. No one would have, but it's leveled everyone. You can't really say that many have been able to deal with this issue very well, apart remarkably from Taiwan, which I believe has less than 10 fatalities, an incredible achievement, but we'll see. We'll leave that one aside. Everyone else, I think, mostly has had a big struggle with this issue, and it's been pretty kind of harrowing. And so the sort of idea that someone has got a governance system that is markedly better than others for dealing with this, well, if you look at the way that America and China have dealt with the problem, you would say at best this is a draw. They both found it very difficult, and you could argue that in fact America has found it far harder. And so this raises all sorts of interesting questions. Firstly, the way in which China figures in our lives now in ways we didn't really expect. Secondly, this fascinating question of whether, as a result of all of the chaos that COVID-19 has brought, particularly to our economies, I think that's where we're kind of the sort of battleground we're moving on to now, after the public health, the major part of the crisis, thankfully, seems to be being managed. What we are therefore really witnessing is a kind of competition over whether the Chinese sort of approach to its economy is going to be able to restore growth, address unemployment, which of course is very serious, and basically deal with the tremendous impact of COVID in ways which shows that it is more viable or more durable or more relevant than the Western sort of capitalist systems in Europe and America. Now, that sounds like a competition, and in a sense it is. There are many scenarios that we could be going into. No one could be able to deal with the economic problems, and that's one kind of terrible outcome. The second is that Europe and America are able to deal with them and thankfully restore themselves to growth. And China is also able to do it. That America and Europe restores themselves to growth and China goes through terrible economic problems. And then, of course, we will start preparing our big victory parties and saying, yes, in the end, we were right. Or which is, I would say, quite likely, you can be certain, but quite likely, China is able to restore itself to a kind of reasonable amount of growth. It is able to address at least the most serious of its employment issues, and Europe and America are really fighting. Now, if that happens, this whole kind of geopolitical terrain that we're inhabiting really becomes very different, because it sort of really erodes the kind of narrative that, you know, in governance at least, sort of liberal democracies, you can call them, you can still call them liberal democracies, are sort of able to kind of deal with governance and able to deal with sort of issues like COVID-19, you know, kind of in ways which at least are more sustainable. This will sort of prove that the governance system that is used by China about this issue, and in this particular respect, is working. And that's, I mean, you may not be able to say much more than that, but that's still a pretty big thing to say. I suppose, you know, kind of as we look at the impact of that potential sort of economic kind of struggle with China coming out the winner, that we then also have to kind of recognize a bunch of other things about the way that the world will look geopolitically after all of this has sort of at least not blown over, but become more manageable and better managed. I think there's going to be 2 or 3 key impacts. The first is a sort of fragmented globalization. And that means a recognition that in some issues like public health challenges, you have got to work together. And so scientists in China and Europe and America and elsewhere are now trying to find a vaccine that may or may not be found. And if they do it collectively, that will be a symbol of this. There'll also, of course, need to be joint action on climate change and these kinds of globally shared issues. So there, yes, there's globalization. But in other areas, even the economic, possibly a fragmented globalization, an attempt to decouple. For instance, the attempts by the United States to really extract some of its kind of economic links into China. And of course, the ways in which China has been central to some of the, you know, kind of personal protective care equipment, you know, having almost like a monopoly in some areas has kind of been a really sort of powerful wake-up call for some, you know, kind of politicians and figures in America. So this decoupling will probably be pretty disruptive, but I think it's imperative, its political imperative will override the economic imperative. So a kind of fragmented kind of globalization, I think, is where we're moving to. That means a sort of, as I think was alluded to earlier, a dual track world, a world in which pragmatic acceptance of the fact that there are these 2 huge partners, these 2 huge entities, the United States and China, that just don't get on, that they are not going to change each other's minds, that they are not going to change each other, that they're not going to be able to change what they themselves think of each other, that we just have to accept that and take the boundaries that have appeared in, you know, kind of the last few weeks and say, okay, we need to kind of accept these as part of a kind of global infrastructure. You know, this is going to be a world in which there are, you know, sort of clear lines between where the US and China are, and we have to somehow navigate that, you know, like a 2-story house. We're moving from a bungalow to a 2-story house, so we have to kind of basically have some sort of mechanism of getting from one floor to the other. However, you know, we just have to sort of live with that, because the only alternative is that the 2 clash like hell and we're in perpetual fights, and it's like living in a ruin. So that's a kind of really a world that demands sort of a lot of management. It's going to be the golden age of diplomats, I imagine. There's going to be lots of people managing this perpetual tension, but it's a world that probably could work. And it's certainly a world in which the worst sort of case scenarios are avoided. So this dual track world, I think, is I feel going to become a reality, even if it's not explicitly said. We're going to see this manifest in all sorts of different areas. I suppose finally, we do have to kind of ask some tough, hard questions about how we do frame discourse about China in our own environments. I mean, I've obviously been looking a lot at the UK debates about China recently, and sort of feel like it's listening to a debate that should have happened 20 years ago. I think, as Charlie said right at the beginning, I mean, the sort of nasty, sort of inconvenient truth is that Britain never really had a policy towards China. It was either run via Brussels, maybe, certainly for trade, or it was run via Washington, or it wasn't run at all. And we now have a sort of extraordinary situation of, in particular, the UK, because of its, kind of aims to leave the common customs union and the common market at the end of the year, sort of putting itself in this position of possibly not having a deal with its main markets in Europe, or not an easy deal, not a very predictable, straightforward deal, possibly dealing with an America which was the kind of great fallback, but which is going to be in economic, real kind of, problems, and yet antagonizing its relations with China, and basically saying that the one potential kind of entity that we might be able to create some new growth with, in view of the fact that China is not a big operator in the UK at the moment, certainly not in terms of trade and investment. There's one possibility we're not going to take. So I suppose that brings me to the final thing, which is, well, the economic impact that we are going into in the UK, Europe, America, means that all of the sort of very bellicose and aggressive rhetoric that we see produced by officials and spokespeople everywhere must be taken with a very, very massive piece of salt, a very massive pinch of salt, because when the real kind of the reality of the economic impact of this crisis hits, when people emerge from lockdowns and they realize how absolutely kind of wasted the economy is, and how they're going to have to do radically different and new things to be able to kind of deal with this, then they have a very stark choice. They either, kind of are flexible and pragmatic and just do stuff, or they live with poverty, they live with recession, maybe even depression, they live with vast amounts of unemployment, and they take really catastrophic consequences from that. I mean, I can't believe that politicians would look at that situation coolly and not want to go along the first route. Although I have seen plenty of evidence in the last few years that politicians sometimes do quite remarkable things, I still cannot see politicians anywhere not wanting to go along the first route. And so I think that will then make a significant change to people's mindsets. I mean, the final thing is, this is going to be really about this race to restore growth. If China can do that more quickly, or more endurably, or better than Europe and America, then it becomes relevant to Europe and America as a potential source of partnership and growth. And all of these other, kind of political issues, all of which are very valid, I'm not denying that they're not valid, are put in a very different kind of context. So my key point, I guess, and I'm thinking about a lot, and I'd encourage others they're not thinking about to think about, is just watch the economic indicators in China compared particularly to America and Europe, and see which pulls out of this terrible situation we're in first, because that will be a kind of moment when we see where political indicators will also follow. Thank you.
Kerry, thank you very much for that. I'm not sure how controversial it is, actually, but I'd just like to pick up, before we go to the questions on it, on this dual track system. We've been hearing over the years, many years, about the rules-based international order, which is basically the US-led post-World War element. You are suggesting that there could be another rules-based order coming in, operating parallel to that. Could you give us a little idea of how that might work? I know the two-story house, but in practice, the UN and the rest of it, which is paralyzed. But also, what difference would that be to what was happening between the Soviet Union and the US during the Cold War?
Yeah, I mean, the sort of origins of rules-based international order are not that old, actually. I think Alistair Johnson at Harvard's done work on this, where he traces it actually to the 2000s, I think, language by Kevin Rudd. So quite late. I mean, it's not really used before that. So of course, there was ideas of a kind of American-led, I wouldn't say hegemony, but kind of dominance and importance of the unipolar world. But I don't think the rules-based system gives it a neatness that I think it's only really retrospectively had. On the Soviet Union and China, the difference. I mean, I think the Soviet Union, era, the Cold War era, was a bipolar world. I think it was a bipolar world. Whereas I think the kind of situation we're moving, I avoid that term for many reasons, but because I don't think it is so stark. There'll be fragmented globalization, but there will be, kind of a lot of sort of interlinkages, which is not true in the Soviet Union case. I think they were, this was an easier thing to deal with because they were almost perpetually decoupled, whereas with China and America, they're not.
Yeah. So this is a coupled dual track as opposed to a decoupled dual track that we're discussing. Great. Now we're going to open up the questions to the panel, which I'm sort of consolidating, but I'd like to go back to the original issue here, but it does broaden out immediately. There's COVID-19, there's the WHO, the World Health Organization, whose action on it is being criticized by the United States, thus this diluting of a global institution. Taiwan, which Harry mentioned that, has actually had one of the best practices towards COVID-19. And I'd like to ask this to all the panel, because if we go back to the beginning of the Trump presidency, even before when he was president-elect, and he asked, what was this one China policy? What would happen if people, or if Europe or the US began to question that using the treatment of the WHO, or the way that they put it as a premise for that? What would happen if they actually moved in against the one China policy? Because this seems to me to be an encapsulation of global health, of a global institution, and this leftover legacy of Taiwan, which is essentially an independent, self-governing territory. Maybe Charlie.
I think the first thing to say there, Humphrey, is that we don't make a decision on China and Taiwan. We acknowledge their position that there is one China, but we don't come down on either side on how that pans out. And I don't see that changing.
Technically speaking, we could recognize Taiwan, couldn't we? Or we could recognize it as a member of the World Health Organization, or we could make that move.
Well, let's just, take the World Health Organization. It's come into a lot of stick because it does over Taiwan, but as it rightly points out, it's the World Health Assembly which makes the decision as to whether Taiwan is a member, and that's done on a voting basis. So what we need to do is to persuade the countries that are members of that, and I can't remember, 190 or whatever it is, that Taiwan needs to be a member, which indeed it does, because if you're trying to construct a global fight against pandemics and antimicrobial resistance and others, then if there's a weak link in the chain, that's not going to help you. But that's up to ensuring that the World Health Organization votes that Taiwan should have a proper membership. And China is doing its damnness to ensure that it doesn't, because it puts politics or people.
Rana, have you got a view on that?
Sure. Can you hear? The line isn't terribly good at the moment, but I assume you can hear me unless you tell me otherwise. I think Charlie's got that exactly right. I mean, the thing is that at the moment, there are a variety of different things going on. It's worth noting, actually, in today's news, that something has happened in terms of language. Li Keqiang has talked about reunification with Taiwan, but for the first time has not talked about peaceful reunification with Taiwan. And that does suggest that there may be, along with obviously the proposal of this new, much more hardline national security law for Hong Kong, a sense that they are moving in a direction that might mean that there's going to be far less compromise. That means that the Trump administration's position of having given more military assistance and not just rhetorical assistance to Taiwan, I think is likely to be maintained by whatever government comes into the US in November. I think whatever happens, the sense that the US and China are on different sides of the fence will be the case regardless of whether the president is Trump or Biden. And I think Taiwan is now strategizing quite strongly on the basis of that assumption realization, linked to the fact that Taiwan's voting population, the 26 million or so people, are still very much tied to the idea of trying to develop as strong an autonomous Taiwan identity as possible. One question that I've asked in the past, and I've written about it in the South China Morning Post, actually, people can find it online still, is the question of, supposing you did have a violent invasion of Taiwan, what happens the next day? and the next week and the next month and the next few years? Is this a sustainable situation for a PLA, which has not lost large numbers of people in combat? Lots of kids from one child families, I know that's stopped, but the age we're talking about, coming back in body bags. Is that a good look for China? I don't think so.
Veerle, can I just play this on, because there's a lot of talk about a possibility of an invasion of Taiwan that Rana's just mentioned. But very little talk about the global community that is recognizing Taiwan's independence from China. Why is that?
Well, I mean, I think countries have agreed that they will respect the one China policy, and that, as has already been said, they don't take a decision on what that means. But at the same time, they have formalized their diplomatic relationship with China. So at the same time, I don't think that whilst we are now discussing what our China policies mean vis-a-vis bilateral relationships, but also how China behaves in international organizations, I don't think we've necessarily thought about the Taiwan question very seriously until now. And I think there are interesting moves that are taking place. I do think that I am Dutch. The Netherlands office, for example, in Taiwan, the representative office has changed its name. It is no longer the Netherlands Trade and Investment Office. It is now the Netherlands office in Taiwan. And that doesn't mean that the Netherlands is going to all of a sudden step up its engagement and diplomatically switch recognition from China to Taiwan, or recognize both at the same time. But it does, I think, indicate that countries are looking more deeply and more holistically at their bilateral relationships with Taiwan, even if they're not official and diplomatic.
Okay. One that's come in now that's quite straightforward and basically needs a sort of yes and no answer, or a week, year, or decades answer. How long will Xi Jinping survive in office? Kerry, perhaps you could start us off with that one.
Well, I think as long as he's healthy. Doesn't look like he's going anywhere anytime soon. So there's no sign of any likely successor. This sort of time in the last sort of cycle, if you want to call it that, in the Hu Jintao era, there were successors, Xi and Li Keqiang, around, whereas now you wouldn't say you saw them at all. So all that sort of portends that unless someone magically appears in the next sort of year or so, in 2022, he will continue at the next party congress, and his presidency will continue. I mean, that's the assumption.
So no internal jostling, that he's going too far, that he's pushing stuff out too much, that his dictatorial manner is threatening the Communist Party?
No, I mean, from what one sees, I mean, so there's a lot of things you can't see, but from what one sees, it's totally, kind of under his control and domination. So there doesn't seem to be any kind of internal domestic threat at all. Whether that's itself a problem, yes. I mean, it might be the brittleness of his power, but I mean, at the moment, he looks pretty dominant.
Veerle, there's one has come in here, the Belt and Road Initiative, which has come into a lot of criticism lately, but give us the components of it that are useful for the developing world in general. And I think to contextualize this, the Belt and Road Initiative, when it was launched a few years back, moved into a huge vacuum where roads and bridges and dams and airports had simply not been built over the 25 or so years that the West was handling that situation.
Yes, I mean, I think this is an excellent question, because a lot of the conversation around Belt and Road, of course, has been focusing on potential strategic concerns or direct negative impact in local countries. And I think those are absolutely valid questions. But at the same time, I mean, as the panel has already mentioned as well, a lot of these countries have serious infrastructure investment needs, and they're not going to get them from other places. There are, of course, financial solutions for infrastructure investment, but sometimes they're tedious, they're very long, they're complicated, sometimes they're rejected. And so countries do, for varying different reasons, look to China for this investment infrastructure. Having said that, at the same time, whilst on the one side, you've got a very initial focus on things like, as you've mentioned, port infrastructure, roads, energy supplies. all of that. At the same time, now we're looking at different ways of the Belt and Road evolving. So, China has launched an initiative called the Digital Silk Road. We've got the Space Silk Road. There are more high technology variations of the Silk Road, which do provide solutions to various countries in the developing world. So, like I said, be that offering digital solutions for healthcare or for banking, or whether that be, just communications more broadly, and internet. These are all things that countries need, that they require for their own development, and China is a country that offers those solutions. The problem is that, of course, so far we have seen problematic ways in which some of these contracts are drawn up. They're very opaque. At the same time, it's not always clear who's driving these projects. So is it coming from a bilateral government initiative, or is this a private sector initiative? Furthermore, in some of these countries, a lot of these, big projects are kind of big ticket legacy items for the political elites. So does that really contribute actually to the development of these countries? And furthermore, some of these Chinese companies haven't necessarily had to consider things like environmental protection and sustainability, engaging with local communities. So these are all things that are evolving in the Belt and Road. As China does this, I think whilst the Belt and Road has been so far a very bilateral initiative, I do think that China is looking to multilateralize it more for financial reasons, but also others, to lend it more credibility. The people that really stand to benefit from this, quite frankly, are developing countries.
There's another question that's linked to that. Maybe I could throw it out to Rana. It's that given that China, is completely embedded in Africa and other places like that, how can we possibly talk about decoupling and extricating ourselves from Chinese supply chains?
Well, I would point out that I haven't been talking about decoupling or getting out of supply chains.
Should I put it to Charlie or such? Charlie, or do you have a view on that?
My view. Well, very briefly, but then let's throw it to Charlie after that. But since you put it, Humphrey, I think the view that we have to take is to understand what the motivations are, as Veerle has just said, from the point of view of the consumer or the customer, if we want to put it that way. Very large numbers of people in South Asia, Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, to some extent also Latin America, are in desperate need of infrastructure. They're in desperate need of investment capital. They're in desperate need of expertise and know-how. Traditionally, during the Cold War, the United States and Soviet Union and the various countries around them provided this in a kind of competition. That kind of competition no longer exists in that particular form. But today, what China has to offer is attractive enough to make many people take it up. If we in the Western world or the liberal world want to push back against that, and I think it's perfectly legitimate to do so, then we also have to put our money where our mouths are as well. But Charlie is more expert than me on these things, so maybe Charlie should speak.
In fact, there's another question in for Charlie, which I'd like you to pick up on, because we covered that. Which is, if China cannot be stopped on the new Hong Kong law, what realistically should UK or the US do about it, given that it contravenes an international treaty?
Well, on the first question, just a couple of brief comments with Rana. I mean, diversification out of China was happening before COVID struck, but there are going to be limits. There are going to be limits to this for very obvious reasons. I mean, you can't all diversify out of China, and China has a very educated population and very good systems and a lot of the necessary inputs. So there is a limit to it. But I think that also this crisis will have made governments think a little bit more carefully about some of the very crucial things that affect them very crucially. Very obviously, some of the health questions and the ability to produce some of the equipment and medicines. So diversification, yes, it's going to continue, but this is not going to be wholesale out of China. The next thing to say is on Hong Kong, what can we do? Well, in a sense, it's if the UK and the US wish to play harder ball, and perhaps I think they should. It's easier to talk about the US rather than the UK. The US has a Hong Kong Act and a Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, and it can implement that. But that is a nuclear option. a sort of intercontinental nuclear
option. I could
option.
just butt in there, Charlie. Is it the UK is a signatory to this treaty? So do we kick it to the US, or I mean, can you explain what obligation we have?
I just sort of finish on the US in the sense that they either lob a nuclear weapon on this one, an intercontinental one, or a tactical one, which means that you don't have to withdraw all the privileges that Hong Kong gets in terms of trade or immigration or technology, but you could, for instance, stop technology or limit technology going to Hong Kong, which probably is in line with some of the views in America anyway. But in terms of what the UK could and should be doing, well, I mean, this is well past the era of gunboats, and it's well past the era of sanctions for reasons that Kerry and other panelists have talked about. But yes, it is, I think, China has been infringing upon an international treaty lodged with the United Nations. We should raise it with the United Nations. It will be immediately vetoed, but at least the
I've lost the audio. Well, I've lost the audio, and John Elliott says, has Huawei pulled the plug on us? Have we all lost the audio?
No, I can hear you. Can you hear? I think
I can hear you too.
Okay, well, my audio is back now. I lost it for about a minute.
Yep. We can hear you.
So we continue with the next question,
Sure.
which is, let me just go through there. There's, yes, one that keeps coming back, and I'll encapsulate it again, is I think that the focus is the camps in Xinjiang, which we all know about, and to what extent we can continue to work with China, and how much does the West call China out on those camps? How much does the trade continue? I mean, the sanctions that we've all talked about, all of that stuff. You've got 2 million or 1 million or however many is in labor camps or re-education camps in Xinjiang, there because of their ethnicity. When does that become unacceptable? Kerry. Rana, can you handle that one then? Kerry is not here apparently.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, my audio went again. Did you get the question, Rana?
Yeah, no, I got the question. I mean, I think this is a very, there are several strands that need to be picked out in the question. The first one is the question of Charlie's come back. when you say the Western world, in fact, one of the things that's also very notable about this question is that large numbers of people in the Middle East and the Muslim world, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and so forth, have been visibly silent. You can't be visibly silent unless it's very cold, I suppose, and your breath is visible, but have been notably silent, one should say, in terms of speaking out about this. And there's a very good point that we should be, I think, talking to countries that are in that kind of intermediate zone. They're kind of caught between Western power, Chinese power, and all of that. And as I think, people have been saying, certainly Charlie and Kerry, working out where new conversations and alliances take place. Secondly, I think it's really important in terms of our own consistency on this question, questions of human rights, to make sure we are asking the same question to countries that are our allies and ones with which we consider to be opponents. So if we're going to call out China on this question, absolutely fair enough to do so. We're talking much more strongly than we have been doing to Saudi Arabia about the questions of their massively abusive situation to do with human rights, both with their own population and, of course, with the large migrant and largely Muslim population, of course, that comes to work there. This is not to suggest that all these things are equivalent. What it is to do, and this is something the Trump administration in particular, I think, is vulnerable on, and it needs to change, is to make it so obvious in some cases that your discussion about human rights is really tied to your security concerns or your economic concerns, that you lack authenticity. That's a very dangerous position to be in. So we must be answering all these questions by looking at our own position and working out where we start from as well.
Veerle, on both on the Xinjiang camps and on the Hong Kong demonstrations, there has been a noticeable silence from Southeast Asia, particularly on the Hong Kong demonstrations. So what we see in the West, where Time magazine, I think, was having as a runner-up a Hong Kong protester for its Person of the Year, is not reflected in the neighborhood, and it's not reflected amongst the Islamic community, as Rana just said. Where does that leave the Indo-Pacific when the US is now coming in with Britain and France militarily and Japan, India possibly, in the sort of juggle for power there? Because you're not going to have you're with us or against it. It's not democracies against dictatorships. This phrase like-minded is being used, but it's very loose. So where does that leave us if on these two key issues of Hong Kong and Xinjiang, there is not support for the Western view in the Indo-Pacific?
I mean, I think that is such an excellent question. And it's a really important one as well. I think the first thing to say about, the Indo-Pacific is that there's no agreement on what the Indo-Pacific is. There's no single view on what this is as a geographic space, but also as a strategic concept. Australia has an Indo-Pacific strategy. Japan has an Indo-Pacific strategy. The United States, of course, has theirs as well. They are not the same thing. Even when India talks about the Indo-Pacific, it is not the same thing. There are these countries place emphasis on different parts geographically, but also in terms of substance. What is it that they're actually trying to achieve in this area? And so I think one notable thing is that, Japan, for all the discussion in their Indo-Pacific strategy around, and it's an initiative, I apologize, Indo-Pacific Initiative, for all their talk around standards and having transparency, battling corruption, all that kind of stuff, they don't necessarily highlight the human rights. And of course, Japan is a democracy. It values human rights. We see it very much as a like-minded state. But they've taken an approach that focuses on other things and hopes to include, different values and different principles, which will hopefully, in general, help these countries develop in a more transparent manner, in which things like media freedom, or at least expression, and other parts of human rights come to the forefront. So I do think that it's really important to think about who your target audience is, how you're trying to, get them to cooperate and see the world in a similar way. And by focusing entirely on human rights or democracy question, you are excluding a great number of countries who don't see the world the same way as you do necessarily, or aren't willing to make their own domestic changes to align themselves in a political and values-based way as you are, or to exert foreign policy the same way that you do. So this is a very, very important strategic question for countries, including the UK, who seek to have a greater role in the Indo-Pacific.
So there's a question, thank you, that's just come in attached to that, because it's very likely, isn't it? I'll go to Charlie for this, that some event is going to propel a foreign policy in the Indo-Pacific against China. I mean, COVID-19 has started it. If there was a massacre or fire in the Xinjiang camps, if there was something in Hong Kong and Taiwan, suddenly you've got the politicians here saying something must be done. Now, we've already established that in the Islamic world and in Southeast Asia itself, there's a different value system there, possibly the dual track that Kerry was talking about. So the question is when this happens, or as this situation unfolds, are we, or is Asia going to be asked to choose between the US and China? And if that happens, if there's a sort of pivotal event there, what is likely to unfold? Charlie?
Well, it may or may not be asked, but I think Asia will do its best not to choose. It doesn't necessarily have to, it sees its bread buttered very substantially in China. Until it sees its bread buttered very much more substantially by the liberal democracies, and so in many ways it will as Veerle says, close its mind to other questions, and certainly not want to jeopardize the bread and the butter thereon. So I'm not quite sure what event you're envisaging, Humphrey. I mean, I've been dropping in and out.
I'm envisaging an event, just to sort of clarify that I think we're of a generation that will remember. I mean, a sort of the pivotal event that led to the Iraq War, the pivotal event that led to the invasion of Afghanistan, the Gaddafi saying about that he was going to go into Benghazi and massacre a lot of people. These lead to foreign policy, which doesn't necessarily grounded in fact. And now that in the US election campaign, particularly, China is likely to be held up as the foreign enemy #1, there is a higher risk of miscalculation there probably than there has ever been.
Yeah, but I think it's a very different situation. I mean, China is enormous and it's powerful, and the sort of examples you've been given were not. The imbalance there was just too great, and I don't think it's, for however much this current American administration keeps talking about decoupling, etc., it's the wrong word. Yes, divergence is happening, and it will be increased more by what's happening in technology and by values and security interests, etc. But there has to be a limit to it. So I think let's get past this election season in America. Let's get past COVID and let's get back to, I think, what Kerry Brown's point early on is that we have to accept that this divergence is happening. We have to limit it to what is strictly necessary, and let's hope that all sides, however many there are in a multipolar world, behave in a mature fashion. But am I confident that will necessarily happen? Well, not looking backwards, I think, but we've got to try.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more for all the panelists to answer. And getting back to COVID again, it's essentially about investigations, inquiries, accountability, and that sort of thing. But if China hid information to begin with, or misled the world to begin with, then the United States is also accused of the same thing, and a higher number of lives being lost there. The rest of it, we've got a similar situation here in the UK. So how will the COVID-19 inquiries, accountabilities, reputations impact on us here in Britain or Europe, on the US, and on China at the end of, as COVID unveils? Why don't we begin going backwards? Kerry, are you still here? We seem to have lost. So Rana, we go Rana, Veerle, and Charlie.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Humphrey. I think that in the medium term, meaning probably for the next year to 3 years or so, we will see what I think was sort of actually something that Charlie said very early on. So in a sense, we're coming back in a circle quite usefully to the beginning, which is, relatively speaking, probably an ability of the Chinese Communist Party to cope in the medium term at a domestic level with the effects of this. I think the combination of what I was talking about, this very strong, very non-liberal nationalist ideology, will combine with its ability to do things which are happening this week. I mean, of course, all the news has been rightly about the Hong Kong security law, but actually the 2 sessions currently happening in China is also pushing forward a whole variety of things, including a new credit bubble, credit injection, not a bubble, of course, well, who knows, using consumer vouchers, things that aren't so glamorous, but actually are rather important in terms of things like stimulating domestic consumption, building new infrastructure. There's opening up, Western China yet again in terms of further building. There's a whole bunch of things happening at home that probably will keep the roof on in terms of stability quite successfully for a while. I do think that in that same period, China's got a really tough haul on its hands to restore its global reputation. Not in the West, where I think it was already getting quite tarnished in all sorts of ways, but in the global South, I think getting back the Nigerias and the Malaysias and the Brazils. Well, Brazil went some time ago, I think, but those sorts of countries which have not been best buddies of China, but think there's enough to make China useful in the world, to say, and to annoy the Americans as well, which is always fun to do, particularly when the president is Trump. That has rather shattered, because the realization that what's happened in China, for whatever reason, has created a huge economic and social disaster in their own countries, is something that they have found very, very unpleasant to deal with. And China has not yet, by any means, I think, found the right tone of voice to deal with that. If they crack that, they'll be back on their way. But right now, I don't see that happening.
Okay. Veerle, perhaps since we haven't got Kerry, you could indicate on how the COVID-19 might impact on the United States' international reputation.
I think. Oh, sorry, Veerle. Yep.
No, Rana, if you want to jump in, feel free.
Who was that question for, Humphrey? Sorry, I didn't want to.
That's for Veerle, because Kerry.
That's
Kerry's vanished a bit. Yeah.
No, Veerle, over to you. Absolutely.
Thank you. Sure. So far it hasn't reflected very well on the United States and how Trump has handled this. And I think in a certain way, even the Chinese are surprised at how things have evolved in the U.S. And this is not just vis-a-vis how it has taken a very kind of strong tone on China, but also how it's handled the situation domestically, which really hasn't gone well. So this, in terms of how the U.S. is able to cope with these sort of crises, is one matter. I think another matter is how it seeks to engage with the international community in international organizations. So I think the point that, for example, the United States raised vis-a-vis that initial resolution draft with regards to women's reproductive rights issues, an objection they had to that, but also an objection they had, for example, to a vaccine patent with the IP being opened up so that everyone could utilize it. I think those types of issues also play into how the United States is viewed amongst its allies. Of course, different voices and different perspectives in countries where such issues are maybe less controversial will have maybe less of an impact vis-a-vis their opinion of the U.S. But in general, I think the trajectory that we've seen vis-a-vis U.S. and its multilateralist approach, or rather the lack thereof, has been quite problematic for whether we see the United States still as a major leader of the international liberal multilateral order.
Okay, Charlie, if you could, but very briefly, because I want to bring Barry in now after that to sum up for us all. Thanks.
Yeah, the original question was to do with the WHO inquiry. First point to make is that nothing will come out of that which harms the Communist Party narrative, because they'll make damn sure that it doesn't. But this shouldn't be a blame game. That really is not going to help anyone. What it needs to do is answer the questions about how we use the information from this pandemic to prevent another one, and what we can do to cooperate more strongly together as the world, as the global powers in health crisis, because they're going to come at us. And that, at the end of the day, I really don't think we should be blaming the WHO. It's us that we have to blame. After all, if you look at the financing of the WHO, and the last published accounts, I think, were December 2018, the UK provided their assessed contributions, but in terms of the the voluntary contributions, the UK was well over $200 million. I'm not even including their Gavi contribution, which was, I think, in total 158 million, and we're the biggest donor to that. China's was $6 million. So 3% of what we gave. Now, I do think that whoever pays the piper has some should at least have some measure of calling the tune. So we need to get our act together in the WHO. If we do want to go get things like rightly Taiwan in, we've got to start persuading countries to support a more sensible line and stop putting politics before people. So that's where I'm on that question.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you for the panel. And Barry Gardner is now coming in to take all the wise words of wisdom that we've heard from you and sum it up into a concise analysis. So Barry, the floor is yours.
Good Lord. Well, I'm not sure about a concise analysis. How long have I got, Humphrey?
You've got about 10 minutes.
Okay, fine.
And as long as the technology doesn't let us down, so wing it.
There were times in this discussion when I had to look down and wonder whether I was sitting on top of a Clydesdale or a Percheron or perhaps a Shire horse, but it was certainly a high horse at some of the comments that we were hearing. And I just want to start off. I really liked your introduction, by the way, Humphrey, when you talked about the interlocked nature of our economies, that analogy that you used about the house being empty. I thought that was very pertinent. And then Charlie talked about this really strange concept that there was a political party in China, the Chinese Communist Party, that was determined to stay in power and that was, wanting to control all information. Look, I've been a politician in government, I've been a politician in opposition, and let me tell you, every political party has as its key objective staying in power because they believe, we all believe, that our way of doing things is going to be better than the other guys. But when it came to control of information, I just think, let's think here. Daily press conferences, closing down Parliament early in order to block accountability, refusal to go on Good Morning Britain against Piers Morgan. The control of information is something that is being used here as well. So I just think we need to get this in a bit of a broader perspective and not to be quite so high horse about it. And what really brings that home, I think, is if you look at the UK, I know international ratings are not something the government is fond of unless it happens to be, doing very well in them. As soon as we become the worst, we don't allow international ratings any longer. But the UK, in terms of COVID deaths per million population, is number 3 in the world. I think it's behind Spain and Belgium. We have 542 per million. We're the third worst. Compare that, go down 90 places further on the list, and you come to China with 3.33 deaths per million population. Now you can say, well, were they all properly reported and so on? But there is absolutely no doubt that actually China has been, as a number of the panelists suggested, actually very efficient in controlling the spread of the disease there. And I think I want to pick up on what Charlie said both at the beginning and again at the end, that this should not be a blame game. This has to be about saying how, in that globally interlocked community that you spoke about, how do we ensure that we work together on the really huge challenges that face us, not just from zoonotic diseases, but also from microbial resistance, antimicrobial resistance, and also in terms of climate change, because that is the other great global interlocked problem that we're having to face immediately together. Rana spoke, and he gave us this 4 points about the Marxist-Leninist, the traditional culture, the actor in the global South, and the role in history. And he picked up a central point about the ability to manage pluralism. And this whole way in which it's the classic problem that we've faced in the enlightened world since the Enlightenment. And that is, how do we live together? And it was very interesting that he posed that question without sort of seeming to allow that China has its particular way, and it's a non-liberal way. But we as pluralists living in a global community must take that on as part of pluralism, as long as that non-liberalism is not an expansionist non-liberalism. And I think that's a really big question. It's one that Kerry came over to in the end and posed a bit more forcefully, perhaps. So there was a question also that was put up on the live comments at that point, which was, how do we take cognizance of the fact that popular support for government has actually been higher in China than it has in the US or Italy or France or Spain or the UK? And I think we have to reflect on that as well. Now, Veerle spoke about the way in which China has managed COVID domestically, but suffered internationally. She used the phrase that COVID is a pretty bad stain on China's international reputation, and spoke about how it had sent doctors and PPE to try and address that in a sort of carrot sense, but also with a stick sense, the aggressive response, saying in France that the French were letting the elderly die in their care homes. Well, again, I might say that that's not much more than Piers Morgan would say in Good Morning Britain over here. But I think here we have to talk about why we are blaming the victim here. And the whole way in which we've set this dialogue up about compensation, about what accountability, when somebody is a victim, this is an unpredictable zoonotic disease, unless you believe the theory, which I don't, that it was manufactured in a laboratory somewhere. But if indeed this is an unpredictable zoonotic disease that is transferred across into human beings, why are we now blaming the victim, or the first acknowledged victim, for that? And instead of thinking, how do we now work together and move forward, a focus on the past is perhaps not helpful. Now, she talked about the differential treatment of friend and foe. She talked about the anti-submarine drills in the South China Sea. And again, there was another pop-up live comment at that point that says, is this not perhaps in response to the US stepped up freedom of navigation operations in the area? So let me move swiftly to Kerry and the way in which he spoke about the future economic progress that China might be able to make against the sort of economic progress that the rest of the world might be able to come out of this recession with. Now, here when he spoke about a dual-track world, and how to frame the debate in the UK about China, it seems to me that if indeed he's correct, and the Chinese, a more autocratic, less liberal system, is able to achieve greater economic progress in coming out of the pandemic than either America or the UK, and we're left with a dual structured global economy, then the question that he posed for the UK and UK lack of policy in this area is indeed a really salient one. Because here we are at a moment where there has been huge global protectionism, the WTO in chaos, and the restructuring of what was that multilateral global order not being clearly signposted as to how we go forward. Protectionism on the rise, and we now in the UK in a very isolated position, isolated from Europe in the likelihood of a poor trading relationship, or a significantly poorer trading relationship than when we were part of the EU, a difficult negotiation to be had with the United States in terms of the protectionism there and the avowed promises of the government to protect our own industries here. And yet the sort of anti-China feeling that we've listened to in the political environment that's been focused on Huawei and others. And it leaves us in a very isolated, a very exposed position. So that's why I think it's really important to think not about blame compensation, but about working our way forward. And I think there are ways in which we can do that, particularly when we're looking at the focus of COVID, because of course, COVID, we can talk about zoonotic disease, we can talk about where that comes from in wildlife and consumption of wildlife, we can talk about it in conservation, and we can talk about it in terms of something that is critically important to China, which is the first global COP, Conference of the Parties, that it will be hosting, which was supposed to be the Kunming COP at the end of this year, on the Convention on Biodiversity. And when looking at the Convention on Biodiversity, to be able to move from COVID into a successful China COP, and China is very keen that that COP is successful, then it seems to me that we have a platform for cooperation about the way in which we treat our natural environment, the way in which we treat other species on this planet, that can move us forward, that learns from COVID, learns what a small global community we are, how interlocked we are, and then gives us a platform to work from Kunming on, I would hope, to a successful COP26 on the climate conference in Glasgow. Now, those are bases for cooperation in the future, which I think we should be using, and we should be using those as a way of charting our future relationship with China, in making sure it's part of a global response to these globally interlocked problems that we face. One final anecdote, and it was in response to the question about how long can Xi Jinping survive. I'm old enough to remember Brezhnev, and the story that went around when Brezhnev had his grandson sat on his knee. And he said to his grandson, and please excuse my Russian accent, he said, so, Zhenya, what do you want to be when you grow up? And Zhenya looked at his grandfather and said, Grandfather, I want to be the Secretary General of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic. And Brezhnev just looked at him. But how can there be two of us?
Thank you, Barry. Great, thank you, Barry. That brought a, what is it, LOL, laugh out loud. Now, in normal circumstances here, we would say that there's wine and nibbles, and we would socialize and discuss and argue and have a generally good time. But we can't because of COVID. So instead, I'm going to thank the panelists and then read you the two last questions that have come in as Barry was speaking. But thank you first to Charlie Parton, Rana Mitter, Veerle Nouwens, and to Kerry Brown for their concise analysis of the situation. And the two last things that have come in here, and I hasten to add that the Democracy Forum is not responsible for the views of the questioners. And one is that the COVID-19 is a planned strategy of the Chinese Communist Party to dismantle top economies and establish its hegemony. How is the Western world going to punish China for this evil act? And the second one that's coming in, or the last one that I've got here, is that the COVID-19 has deeply affected the world in a negative manner. The true colors of the Chinese Communist Party is now known, and why don't we boycott it and isolate it completely, which I think goes against Rana's view that we need a good but robust relationship with China. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for the technical, whether it was Huawei or whatever technical thing enabled us to do this. And thank you, the Democracy Forum, for bringing together such an excellent bunch of speakers to give us this view.